So I'll start with two matters I'm not going to talk about today, but that I do want to mention to you, and that we will return to for future lectures. The first is the tentative, fragile, but nevertheless hopeful signs that maybe we're on our way to a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities in Gaza. And this is right something that I was going to speak with you about next week anyway, because we are now coming up on the second full year of the war in Gaza. And this is a theater of tremendous humanitarian suffering, starvation, the death of children, terrible casualties. And the idea that it might actually begin to move into a different phase, and here, right, I do think we have to recognize that it is the Trump negotiated or the Trump proposal that appears to be serving as the basis for the potential ceasefire or cessation of hostilities. We will maybe have a better idea by the time we get together next week. But I do want to reflect not just on the immediate hopeful signs coming out of Gaza, Israel, the region with the US's involvement, but also on the history of the last 2 years and the broader context moving forward in the aftermath of 2 years of war. The other thing I'm going to notice very quickly and reserve for a future discussion is that at the beginning of this week, Donald Trump submitted to Congress, or at least it came to our attention at the beginning of this week, that he had made a determination of war and hostilities with so-called enemy combatants coming out of various drug gangs importing fentanyl and other illegal drugs to the United States. And that apparently this is the authorization or the pretext that is being used to license the bombing of boats that are coming from Venezuela in the direction of the United States. And I just need to underline, and we'll talk about this in detail, but how dangerous and problematic this holding is. On the one hand, it's a clear violation of international law in several respects. We simply do not have the capacity to declare those who are importing a consumer product, albeit an illegal and dangerous consumer product. Fentanyl is killing hundreds of thousands of people, but it is not the same thing as taking up arms against the United States, right? And so there is a deliberate disregard of the boundaries of international law, of the clearly defined legal categories. And if this becomes a matter in front of a court that has the authority to hear it, I think this will be clearly illegal. And I'll just note the analogy here for a moment. I think by analogy, a foreign government would be perfectly justified in blowing up an American oil tanker on the understanding that the product contained on that boat or that ship is dangerous to the people of their country, dangerous to the habitability, the future of the planet, right? And so if we start bending these categories, if we start disregarding them, if we start inventing pretexts, down that path lies international anarchy, international lawlessness. And while this administration sees an advantage to itself in the short term from having permission to be lawless, I think in the long term it's to nobody's advantage in our highly globalized world. The second thing I will say is domestically, this has terrifying implications, right? Because if the gangs are not just operating in Venezuela and in the high seas, we know it is absolutely true that they have extensive operations in the United States, and we declare them enemy combatants. We can then use the military domestically to go after them. I believe we are already seeing highly militarized tactics being used by ICE in Chicago, especially, but also the speech by the president at the beginning of the week in front of the brass of the military, the top generals and admirals, basically declaring that we should use American cities as places where we can practice our troop operations, trying to lay the groundwork for deploying the military domestically. Again, I think this order, while it is clearly unconstitutional and illegal, moving now to domestic law, the President of the United States cannot unilaterally declare war and cannot, right, open a new front, a new designation of enemy combatants without congressional authorization. And if he begins to enforce this domestically, it will violate various laws and the Constitution. The question is, can he be held to account? How can he be stopped? And so, again, a topic for another session coming up later this month. But right now, I just wanted to note this. Today, I'm obviously going to speak with you about the government shutdown. And I'm going to come at it in a few different ways. I want to suggest that this is not, if you will, an ordinary shutdown. The process via which the United States budgets is probably the most dysfunctional in the democratic world, and it doesn't work well in general. 12 separate appropriations bills that each have to be passed independently from each other, and it clearly does not work well within the era of high polarized partisanship that is paralyzing Congress's capacity to effectively legislate. And so, as you can see, one of the images I've put on the board, sorry, we're closed. And I don't just mean that in terms of the government is closed. I mean, in particular, that in the last 20 years, right, in the period of hyperpartisanship, which is, I think, probably appropriately dated to around 20 years ago, but is growing more and more extreme with each passing year. Congress has become a completely dysfunctional institution. This makes budgeting hard. It also opens the door for greater unilateral action by the president and the courts because one of the three branches is all but paralyzed. And in ways that I'll talk about today, I think that the right combination of the Department of Governmental Efficiency, DOGE, and the shutdown and the way it's being used by the Trump administration indicates a vast extension of executive power that is being used to do something that, frankly, Republicans have wanted to do since the 1980s, which is dramatically scale back or dismantle the institutions of the New Deal state, the vast expansion of the federal government, its regulatory power, its power to intervene in the economy, its power to provide welfare or services to the citizens of the United States, especially to those most vulnerable, and that, frankly, Congress has been unable to do this not only because it is polarized and dysfunctional, but also because all of these programs are in fact popular or serve important constituencies. And this is why constitutionally the discussion about creating or scaling back or dismantling governmental programs is supposed to occur in the legislative branch because it is diversely constituted. Its constituencies are smaller and its representatives are responsive to those constituencies. The President of the United States has no specific constituency because his constituency is the United States as a whole, because he is term limited to 2 terms, because he's in his second term. There is, frankly, not the mechanisms of accountability. He can get away with gutting the welfare state, the administrative state, the New Deal state, in the way that Congress cannot, because they have to go back and face their constituents and stand for re-election again. And the fact that Congress and the Supreme Court are letting the president do things that up until now would have been considered illegal and unconstitutional impound funds, fire people who are insulated from partisan hiring and firing, means that things that frankly would never be authorized by Congress are being carried out under the pretext of governmental efficiency or governmental close down. We see here, right, the ordinary signs of close down, the national parks being closed, the Smithsonian and the National Zoo being closed, but then we also see the extraordinary signs. And so this is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, right, one of our big federal agencies. And on its website, if you go visit it, it says not that the government is shut down due to a funding crisis, but that the radical left are going to shut down the government and inflict massive pain on the American people unless they get their $1.5 trillion wish list of demands, right? And so note, right, that the emails of government employees, the automatic response during the shutdown was altered by the federal government, by the Office of Budget and Management of the Budget, OMB, right, to say, right, this is the Democrats' fault. This is being weaponized in two senses, right? Weaponized to do the work of gutting the New Deal state, weaponized for partisan advantage, by the way, with a high level of disinformation. And so I do think, again, this shows with great clarity, and I'll state it now, and I'll look greater into the sources of polarization in American politics as we get further into this, but it displays the extent to which one of our two main parties has increasingly turned against the constitutional structure that the rule of law and democracy depend on in the United States, has turned into a post-truth party that is willing to engage in systematic disinformation on social media and via, right, the right-wing media ecosystem, and doesn't care that it obviously knows what it's saying isn't true. And I do frankly worry not only that this causes Americans to lose faith in governance, in our capacity to resolve our differences via the normal political channels available to us, but that it also leads the Democrats in the way that we're seeing with gerrymandering to basically fight fire with fire. And maybe that is the appropriate response, but please note that we are all damaged. We all, right, lose some of the fidelity to the norms that sustain our democracy if we sink to the level of the worst party, the worst actors in American politics. All right, so let's jump into some of the details here. And I'm starting, if my slides will advance, with a little bit of information, and I will just be very brief about this. Shutdowns have become increasingly common since the late 1970s, early 1980s, when an attorney general held basically a legal finding that's continued to be enforced since, that the executive cannot continue to keep the government open unless Congress appropriates resources to do so. That can either be a budget or a continuing resolution. We have increasingly used, right, continuing resolutions, stopgap measures over this period of rising polarization. This is a period of so-called partisan parity, right? Neither party has firm control of Congress, and therefore they have to be able to work together in order to pass a budget, in order to pass a continuing resolution. And yet, right, this is also a period of polarization in which working with the other side is increasingly seen as a sign of treachery, of betrayal of your party's unilateral control over what is true and right in American politics. This is the era, in other words, of existential politics. The other side is a threat to the very continued existence of the kind of society we want to inhabit. If you work with them well, then you're working with the enemy. This is a diagram showing you where the shutdown hits hardest, right? EPA, education, commerce, labor. Where it hits hard, but not as hard, the State Department, the Interior, Agriculture, Defense, and where it is least damaging, right? The Small Business Administration, Treasury, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security. And I'll just be quick about this. Some of this is mandatory, right? Statutory. That is to say, some of the employees are designated by statute as those who cannot be laid off, furloughed, etc. during a shutdown. And so they continue to work and continue to be paid. And then some of it is discretionary. A lot of the furloughs in particular can be discretionary. Who do you ask to keep working? Who do you get to pay? Who do you send home and say, we'll pay you once this is all over? Who do you fire, right? There is a fair bit of discretion in this. And I will just point out to you, right, while we got 90% of the EPA workers furloughed, note that that agency only has 15,000 employees. So that accounts for 13,000 people being furloughed. Whereas the Department of Defense is furloughing, in terms of percentages, half as many, right, of their employees, right, 45 as opposed to 90%. But because it's so much bigger, that accounts for 335,000 people being out of work. We don't know the exact figures on how many people are either being forced to work without pay or being sent home until this is all over. I think the best estimates are it's between 650,000 and 1 million people. And please note, among the things we don't have is the jobs report that was supposed to come out a couple days ago, because, right, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is shuttered. The data has been collected, but the analysis has not been completed. And so we do know that the American economy has been not creating jobs at the pace that it should if it is going to continue to grow. And that this, right, sudden, immediate creation of 600,000, 1 million more unemployed people, unpaid people at least, is not going to be healthy for the economy. And it's going to have other effects, right? Families that depend on, right, supplemental nutrition assistance, children who depend on school lunches, they're not going to get their government benefits. And the result will be, right, they will have less money in their pockets to spend on other things as well. In terms of just a few details, and I'm going to point to two primary examples here, right? The Labor Department is typical in the sense, right, that you have a small fraction of the workforce working with pay, moderate fraction of the workforce working without pay, 20% of the workers, and 75% of the workers furloughed, not working, right? And that's why the Bureau of Labor Statistics cannot produce the jobs data and the other data that we use to steer economic policy in this country until the shutdown is over. This means we're flying blind in economic policy. And I should have said this at the outset. Let me back up for a second and note that I don't see any good reason to believe that this will be resolved quickly. On the one hand, that there's a good article in the Washington Post, there does appear to be some genuine trepidation in the White House behind the bravado. And we'll see in a few minutes the Republicans are being blamed for the shutdown more than the Democrats. And it is also the case, given the fragility in the economy, that something that further damages the economy while the Republicans have unilateral control over the federal government and more likely, therefore, to be blamed for economic stagnation, that they would prefer to avoid that as well. But having said that, in ways I'll show you in a moment, it is also the case that Donald Trump and Russell Voigt in that Office of Management of the Budget and others within the Republican administration and their allies in Congress see this as an opportunity to punish blue states. And I'll jump ahead to this for a second and come back to this slide in a moment, right? And so the idea, right, that the government is cutting democratic agencies, that blue states are being punished, right? And at this point, I think we're up to $28 billion in projects that the federal government has announced it's pausing or canceling for blue states and cities in the last few days, right? Since the shutdown has occurred. And that Trump says this is an unprecedented opportunity to continuing cutting the agencies of government he doesn't like. And then I just want to add, and again, I think this is very revealing. If you are watching anything but Fox News, if you are not following right wing opinion leaders on Twitter or Instagram, you're not seeing these stories. But these stories are out there, they're being amplified, they're being pushed, they're circulating broadly. That what the Democrats are doing is demanding as a condition of funding the government that, quote, illegal aliens get free healthcare, right? And to be as clear as possible, we'll get into this in a moment, the Democrats are definitely demanding that the cuts to Obamacare, Affordable Care Act subsidies be restored. But undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Obamacare, right? So this is pure disinformation. Apparently, this was discussed for about 10 seconds in the meeting between the Democratic leadership and the White House that occurred at the beginning of the week to try to avert the shutdown. And immediately everybody agreed that this was disinformation. It wasn't worth discussing, right? But nevertheless, this is what is being fed to Republican voters and those who lean in this direction or participate in this quadrant of the media system. And this reflects this idea of maximum partisan warfare everywhere all the time, which has become the calling card of the Trump administration. And so that's the reason I think that the Trump administration doesn't just see this as problematic, but sees this as potentially advantageous. They can circulate disinformation about it, and they can use it as a pretext to accomplish things that they wanted to accomplish anyway. The Democrats, on the other hand, I think have very few incentives to negotiate and, in particular, to back down, right? You know, I should be careful. They will negotiate if they think that the Trump administration and their allies in Congress, that from the other, I should say, their colleagues in Congress from the other side of the aisle, are willing to consider restoring some of what has been cut from Obamacare, maybe some of what has been cut from Medicaid, to take back some of the punitive features of the one big beautiful bill. Of course, this raises the issue then that that bill will no longer be revenue neutral. It will no longer, right, be able to put the large tax cuts that were placed in it that primarily go to the wealthiest in our country in place. But I think, frankly, it's possible, right, that this could be an outcome. It won't be good for the long-term fiscal health of the country, but in ways that I'll show you, it'll actually be good for many low to middle income Americans, including many people who voted for Donald Trump. It's not a bad fight for the Democrats to be fighting on, and it calls attention to the features of the big beautiful bill that are least popular and that the Republicans least want to be accountable for. Apparently, in that meeting I referred to, Schumer and Jeffries and the Democrats called attention to the fact that the notices are going out now what the new Affordable Care Act premiums will be. And what those notices show is that a lot of people will be paying $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 more next year for what they were getting this year, right? And that Donald Trump was surprised by this. He was not aware of this. I don't know if that gives the Democrats any leverage. Coming back now to how the shutdown affects different agencies, I want to focus for a minute on Homeland Security. And here again, right, 16% of the employees are able to continue working and being paid. 5%, a very small fraction, are furloughed. 78% are working with no pay. That includes a large number of immigration and customs enforcement agents, roughly 20,000 people. And if you look at this, right, this is the official accounting of who is being retained. It doesn't really tell you at all who the 5%, the really small portion of the workforce being furloughed is. But the Washington Post reported, and I think it's very important to note, that two agencies were shut down. One of them is the agency that controls disinformation in our social media. Unsurprising, that agency has been targeted for a long time by Republicans. When I say controls, does its best to propagate policy that might do something to limit the spread of disinformation. Right now, it's a losing battle. But the other agency, right, this is called the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Safety Agency, CISA. I don't know if you'd ever heard of this. I'll be honest, I had never heard of this until the shutdown. And it is, right, the agency that counters cyber attacks on American infrastructure, right? And this includes governmental websites and databases. It includes the uh, computer and algorithmic programs that control the distribution of electricity across the grid, the distribution of water, the operation of dams. It includes our banking system where there's so much electronic traffic these days, and it includes our personal computing as well. And there are literally tens of thousands attempted cyber attacks a day from China, from North Korea, from Iran, from Russia, from privateers, from individuals trying to gain some sort of access to valuable information or resources or steal stuff and then, right, hold it hostage until they are paid. And here, I think, is just a really good example of an agency that nobody has ever heard of that's doing really important work in the federal government. And I want to suggest that there are thousands of such agencies, lots of places where the American people depend on the well functioning of their government. And when it doesn't function, that's when they discover, wait a sec, I was depending on this thing that I wasn't even aware of. It's why Congress very often doesn't do the cuts that the president wants them to do because they actually have the staff and the expertise or get the witnesses to tell them, wait a sec, if you cut that, you're going to damage your own constituents, damage the American people. Don't do it. All right, so let's talk about the Democrats and what they're fighting for a moment. And I think it's important to see, I've got some data from the Kaiser Family Foundation on the board here, that in 2021, there was an expansion of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, right? And this was justified by the fact that we were in the middle of a pandemic. People were losing their jobs, unable to work, yet needed health care. And so more people were going to turn to the Affordable Care Act, but might not have the resources to afford it. So the subsidies were increased. And so please note what happened, right? In 2021, the first year of the increased subsidies, a rather small number of people joined Obamacare in addition to those who were already on it, 600,000. But beginning in 2022, right, actually 2.5 million more people joined. In 2023, another 2 million people joined. These subsidies, which were justified by the pandemic, were set to expire in 2023, but in the Inflation Reduction Act, they were extended, right? And then in 2024, we saw the single largest increase, right, in enrollment in Obamacare. 5 million, almost 5 million new people in the program. And that actually continued into 2025 with 3 million more people. And I want to explain why the growth is slow but constant and accelerating. And that has to do with the places where people are joining. They're joining, right? The darker the color, the more the increase, right? The states that are in black here have seen more than a 200% increase in enrollment, and they're all Republican-controlled states, so-called Republican trifectas. They control the legislature, the governor, and the judiciary in these states. And these are states that have not promoted the Affordable Care Act, do not do as much public service announcement about enrollment, do not set up, some of them, marketplaces so that their citizens can have easy access to comparison shopping. So I think a lot of what is happening here, if I have it right, is that there's a kind of word of mouth spreading. Your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, your relatives tell you, guess what? The Affordable Care Act is more affordable now than last time you looked at it. Maybe you should take a second look. And the result is, and I'll say this very quickly, right, that in the counties and states that voted for Donald Trump, that's where the big expansion has occurred, 157% expansion. In the states that voted for Harris, only a 36% expansion. Now, this is taken away by the one big, beautiful bill. And I just want you to see what this will do, right? If you're a family of four making $40,000 a year or less, and just let that sink in for a second. Think about trying to support four people in 21st century America on $40,000 a year. You're going to see an $850 increase in your premiums, right? If you're making $45,000 for a family of four, a $1,600 increase, $55,000, a $2,400 increase, $75,000, almost $3,400 increase, and it keeps going up, right? The people making $130,000 a year or more, and that may sound like a lot of money, but if you're trying to live in San Francisco or New York or another major American city, it's actually not a lot of money to afford to, right, feed and house and clothe and take care of the medical expenses of four people. They're going to see, well, it's hard to predict, but they're going to lose their tax credit altogether. And by the way, that tax credit was averaging about $11,000 in the last few years, right? So this is what the Democrats are fighting for. And I want to be as clear as possible. The Republicans will say back, right? Well, these were meant to be temporary increases only during COVID. COVID is over. We're not in a pandemic anymore. So why should these, right, short-term increases be continued? And I want to point out that in one sense, COVID is over, and in another sense, the economic after effects of COVID are still with us. And in particular, the one I want to focus on is inflation, right? And so we are now 4.5 years into a period where the average inflation has been 50% more than the federal target, right? The Federal Reserve target, or more than 50% more, right? 3%. 6%, 7%, the target is 2%. And the reason the target is 2%, well, in part because if, right, it's more than 2%, then inflation can become self-feeding, but also because wages tend not to increase much faster than 2% a year. And so you're going to erode the economic viability of many middle class and working class families if inflation is more than 3%. And that's exactly what is happening. The clearest place this is reflected is in US household debt, right? And mortgage debt, auto loan debt, student loan debt, credit card debt, home equity line of credit debt. We are at the highest level of consumer indebtedness that we've ever been in. And the majority of people who are in this kind of debt are there because they can't afford not to be. They can't afford to pay their bills without ringing up big credit card debts. They don't know how they're going to pay their credit cards down. A big source of this has been increase in housing costs, right? Mortgage costs from 2020 to 2025 have gone up more than 10%. Rental costs have gone up about 5%. These are high levels of inflation. Childcare, by the way, has gone up 6%. And so the idea that, well, COVID's over, and so people can afford to pay $1, $2, $3, $4,000 more a year for health insurance just doesn't jibe with the data. I think the Democrats have a solid case to be made that this is not the time to saddle, right, 20 million Americans, 25 million Americans with a great deal more expense for healthcare. The other aspect of this I want to spend a few minutes on, and I think this is also really important, is to recognize that this is not just a government shutdown. This occurs in the aftermath of the Department of Governmental Efficiency having gutted a large number of agencies by firing their employees. And I am going to look at this analytically to try to indicate what the targets were. And here I'm going to say, rather uncontroversially, I hope, that there is inefficiency in our government. And it would be a good idea to address it, to find where it is, to figure out how to fix it. If it were easy to fix, it would probably already have been addressed, but we could use a blue ribbon commission studying this stuff, issuing a white paper, and then it would be really hard work to diligently implement its recommendations and eliminate some of the inefficiency in our government. But that is not what the Department of Governmental Efficiency did. It went in with a hacksaw and cut away from the agencies that, frankly, the president and Elon Musk don't like, right? And so the way this diagram, right, this is the diagram of agencies facing Doge layoffs. They're marked in red versus those that have received a budget increase, either under the president's budget or the big, beautiful bill. And they are arrayed on an ideological spectrum. So the way this works, you ask people, do you think, right, the USAID or the EPA or Health and Human Services or the National Institutes of Health are liberal or conservative? And most people say about all of those agencies, along with the Department of Education, they're liberal, right? And so they're put over to the left side of the diagram. You ask them, do you think the Department of Defense or ICE or the National Nuclear Security Administration are conservative or liberal? And they say conservative, right? And as you can see, right, based on that perception, everything that has been cut is on the left side of the spectrum. I would challenge anybody to defend the proposition that there is no governmental inefficiency in the Department of Defense. What this really was not an effort to find and address and root out inefficiency. This was an effort under the pretext of inefficiency to attack the agencies that the right wing of the Republican Party hasn't liked for a very long time. This is also true for the government shutdown. The way in which the rules work, they actually require primarily agencies on the left to furlough their employees. And I believe we should anticipate with Russell Voigt at the helm of the Office of Management of the Budget that some of those who are furloughed will in fact be fired, and that it will redouble the effort of DOGE to really disable the agencies of the government that they do not like, simply by hollowing out their workforce so they cannot continue to do their work. And I just want to note the modality, the way this is being done. This is being done by unilateral executive power to gut agencies, and it's being done because, right, Republicans going back to Ronald Reagan, if you look at the platform of 1980, proposed that this be done. But then they took the constitutional path to do it. They proposed in their budgets, they proposed via legislation that Congress do this. And Congress did, in fact, do some of this, but very often Congress functioned in the way that it's supposed to function. These are, especially in the House of Representatives, people who have relatively small constituencies that represent not all of the country, but a narrow slice. If you start attacking, right, school lunches, which is happening during the Trump administration, right? Make America healthy again. Let's take away all the fruit and vegetables in school lunches, happening right now, right? That's hardly healthy, but nevertheless, if you try to do that through Congress, it's not only that the people who lose their children's lunches come to your office or write a letter or send an email or pick up the phone, it's also that the farmers who are often local farmers, or maybe their big agribusiness, are located in your state, and that the representatives from Nebraska and Iowa and Maine hear from their constituents and say, don't do that. And so they don't, right? That's why the Constitution assigns to Congress the power of the purse, the power to make law, because they have the information required and the accountability necessary to make good legislation. And they didn't do this because these programs retain broad-based support, and they would lose their jobs. They have to go up for election again. Donald Trump will never go up for election again. Donald Trump has, right, no particular constituency, and that is why he's using executive power to do this rather than asking Congress to do this. But the second thing I want us to notice is that executive power is being used in ways that were understood to be unconstitutional or illegal when the agencies were created, right? And clearly, this violates the intent and the background understanding of their mandates. They explicitly say in their enabling legislation that the president doesn't get to fire at will those who work for them. That's up to Congress, right? But Congress and the Supreme Court are allowing the president to do this because, frankly, they're both controlled by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has wanted to do this for 40 plus years, but has been unable to do it via Congress. It appears to me that the Republican Party is increasingly prioritizing its policy goals over its fidelity to the law and the Constitution, and that this is a really dangerous sign for democracy when one party gives up on adhering to the rules of the game and the norms that structure the maintenance of the rule of law and effective power sharing. Then democracy very often fails, especially if it stays down this course, and I see no sign of a course correction. So with that in mind, I now want to pivot to the question, why, right? Why, on the one hand, are we having such trouble budgeting? Why, on the other hand, do we have, right, a party that is increasingly attacking the very agencies on which the American people rely, the agencies of the New Deal state? And why is it the case that it is willing to use illegal or illegitimate means to do so. And here I'm going to point to polarization and several metrics or causes of polarization, right? But let's just start with the obvious. We are more polarized in 2014 than we were in 1994. I'll show you in a few minutes. We're more polarized in 2024 than we were in 2014. And I'm not going to bother to unpack these diagrams. I assume that this is obvious. First causes of our polarization: diverging attitudes about race and immigration. And again, I hope this is relatively straightforward. I've actually shared this information with you before, but whereas Democrats have become more progressive about issues of race and inclusion, Republicans have remained quite constant. Whereas white liberals are much less inclined to think of immigration as a critical issue, white Republicans or conservative white voters are basically continuing to rank this as an incredibly important and dangerous issue. And here I want to refresh your memory about one of the people who I think explains this best as far as I know, and that is Arlene Russell Hochschild, now an emeritus professor at UC Berkeley, and the author of these two very good books, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right, and Stolen Pride, Loss, Shame, and the Rise of the Right. And these are ethnographic sociology. She's really trying to get inside the heads of the people who she has from her perch in Berkeley often a hard time understanding. How can you be doing these self-destructive things? And what she suggests is that stolen pride, feeling alienated from your own land, is giving rise to a hunger that the Republican Party is feeding, and that the complete submission to Trump's executive unilateralism is explained by this sense that you've lost control of your own country, and that those with less right to belong, less desert to benefits and opportunity are stealing the country from you. And Donald Trump is the one person who is committed to taking it back, right? So there's this allegory she uses, which I've spoken with you about before, that working class, right, less privileged Americans were standing in line to gain access to a city over the hill. The city represents financial security or prosperity, and the line was moving slowly but steadily. If you did your work, if you paid your dues, if you got your education and went to your job every day, economic security was over the hill. It was there for you. And then beginning in the 1970s, 1980s, that line started to stall. And then beginning in the 1990s and since then, Black and brown people have been cutting in that line in front of you. And not only that, if you try to raise a stink and say, wait a sec, I've been waiting in this line for a long time, government officials come in and say, no, you have to stay where you are. These people are coming in front of you. Right? And so that sense that it's no longer a society where the economy works for the prosperity of the white working class, the white rural residents, the white poor, even the white middle class, and that in some sense those who are less deserving, right, that the Black and the brown people who maybe don't even legally belong to be in this country, who don't work as hard, who are poor because they're lazy, not because the economy is stacked against them, that this is what is feeding the anger, the grievance going into American politics. So let me leave off there with Hochschild's, I think, very important analysis. The idea that Trump and only Trump is the person who gets this and who's able to do something about it, I think is causing the Republican Party to ignore right, the illegality, the unconstitutionality, the abuse involved in the ways in which he's doing it. It means that Congress is not standing up for its powers and prerogatives as the Constitution and the Federalists assumed that they would. It means that the Supreme Court is, in many ways, at least temporarily, licensing, right, the illegality of this administration. And part of the background to this is the growth of inequality, right? And so this is, I said, first structural source really should be the second structural source to do with race, right, and immigration. First structural source, growing inequality. Second structural force leading to unbridgeable partisan divides and existential politics. And we've looked at this together before. It's just stunning to recognize how equal our society was in the 1960s and how great the inequality is today. But it's not just, right, that we've gone from inequality to much greater equality to much greater inequality again. It's that it is geographically unevenly distributed, right? And so uneven access to opportunity compounds economic inequality. If you are in, right, the red or the yellow regions of this map, you are in areas where your prospects for income and your children's prospects for income are very low. If you're in the blue areas on this map, you have much greater prospects for economic security and mobility. And then we note, right, again, where the polarization is coming from. Our parties are racially totally dissimilar from each other. The Democratic Party basically is a multiracial coalition party that reflects the right actual changing demographics of the country, although the Republican Party is a little bit more racially diverse in 2024, it is still a largely white party. But I think this is also extremely important, which is to say that practically 75% of the Democratic voters come from densely populated areas, right? From cities and suburbs. And that those are areas that are more diverse, but also more likely to have greater economic opportunity. The Republican Party represents those who come from the less densely populated areas of our country, the areas with less economic opportunity and greater concentrations, therefore, of grievance and anger. Those are the areas that Arlie Russell Hochschild is studying. By the way, the capturing of American politics by the economic elite further underlies this polarization. Um, One more issue that I'm going to point to very quickly here is COVID. And not just COVID, but the COVID vaccine, the COVID governmental policies, the idea that we really did fracture as a society. And if you're like me, you live in a place where everybody around you gets the vaccine and nobody has any sympathy for those who are anti-vax, you may not really understand the deep divide here. But I do think it is a deep divide, and that part of the reason Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health and Human Services is that this really signaled to voters that Donald Trump understood how angry they were about having been told you can't go to work, about having been told that your children can't go to school, about having to be told that you couldn't go on to restaurants or to movies or get on planes. And especially if you wanted to do any of that stuff, you had to get a vaccine. You had to put a foreign substance in your body. Many people view this as a violation of liberty and a fundamental right uh, usurpation of power by the federal government. And they mistrust the federal government even more as a result. They're happy to see it shut down. They're happy to see it defunded. They are angry about what happened 4 years ago. And now we get to, right, the nature of the divide. I just want to be as clear as possible. This is asymmetrical polarization. The Democratic Party is a little left of center, and that's primarily because it's moved there recently. The Republican Party has stayed very right of center for a very long time. This is right leading not only to the parties being polarized, our elected leaders being polarized, but average voters being polarized. Do you have a very unfavorable view of the other party that's gone from 21% to 62%? It's tripled for Republicans. It's also tripled for Democrats from a slightly lower starting place to a much higher ending place. We tend to think that people in the other party are closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, lazy, or all of the above. We have antipathy to the people in the other party, and this means that we're not listening to each other, we're not learning to each other, we don't have a civil orientation to our political conflict. The other side is the enemy. The other side is treacherous. They're betraying the United States. We, the Democrats, are letting illegal immigrants into the country, allowing them to vote, want to give them health care, want to give them the jobs that should be going to good, white, working class Americans. And this is paralyzing Congress, right? You can look at this, which I've shown you before, right? The degree to which the two parties overlapped in their voting patterns in Congress in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s. They were co-sponsoring and voting for each other's legislation. And then in the 1980s, this begins to come apart. By the time you get up to the 1990s and the present century, essentially, Republicans are only voting for Republican-backed legislation. Democrats are only voting for Democratic-backed legislation. And Congress is not working. Fewer and fewer and fewer bills being passed. And to make it as clear as possible, if you look at the ideological extremism of House Republicans and compare it with Democrats, right? It is, again, asymmetrical. This is not each side has become more extreme or less willing to work with the other. There are differences in our two parties, and it's part of what I'm raising the alarm bell about. I'm really concerned that the Republican Party has in many ways become so extreme that not only will it not with Democrats, but it sows the seeds of disinformation willingly, aggressively, irresponsibly in social media, and it uses, condones, and is increasingly able to get away with illegal, unconstitutional forms of action. So, final piece of the puzzle here in terms of sources of polarization, the media, right? And obviously our media system is undergoing a vast and rapid transformation with the introduction of digital technology, social media, and artificial intelligence. Again, we've talked about this together before, but really it appears based on very complicated methods of analyzing where communication occurs, how people get their news, who they're speaking with, that we have two fairly distinct media systems or subsystems in the United States, a right-wing media ecosystem and a left to mainstream media ecosystem, with the left and the mainstream in communication, in dialogue with each other, right? The Wall Street Journal is part of this media ecosystem, and then Fox News is kind of the center, but Breitbart, etc., on the right-wing media ecosystem. This just gives you a slightly greater level of detail on who belongs to the left and center media ecosystem, who belongs on the right. And again, you add to that social media that allow for the unfiltered propagation of disinformation. And you have not only many of us belonging to echo chambers that just tell us what we want to believe, what we want to hear, but also environment that permits the rapid transmission of lies and does not hold anybody accountable for spreading disinformation. Again, just very quickly, ideological polarization in the media, and please note again, it is asymmetrical. There's a more or less even distribution, with the most viewership on in the left and center being on the moderate or the middle of the ideological spectrum, whereas on the right, the vast majority of the viewers go to the far right stations. Let me not continue with this because I want to say one more thing to you and we're running out of time. But the idea that we now have a media system that serves as a propaganda feedback loop that just keeps, right, the media system, the public it serves, the politicians who are in it, circulating disinformation without any accountability, I think is part of what is happening in the Republican Party today. But having said all of that, I now want to pull back and think just for a moment about the health of American democracy. And I find this recent survey from the New York Times to be very illuminating, right? In December of 2023, not too long ago, right, the number one issue for voters was the economy. And it still is, although, right, it's lost about a quarter of the people who were saying that it was the number one issue. The number two issue was inflation. Thankfully, that's way down today, right? What has jumped way up in its place, displacing both inflation and immigration, is polarization, right? And by the way, number three is Republicans. I think that's a fascinating finding. What is the most important problem facing the country? The Republican Party. And please note, before you get too excited about that, the Democrats are the sixth most important problem facing the country, right? The fourth most important problem is the state of democracy. And please note, if you were to put together polarization, the state of democracy, and the two parties, by far and away the largest problem facing the country today has to do with the dysfunction of our governmental processes and the polarization of our two parties. And this is leading a majority of Americans to conclude that we are too politically divided to solve the nation's problems. Again, that is growing rapidly. The number of people who have some cautious optimism about the political future is shrinking quickly. And for the 33% who think we can still solve our nation's problems, my joke is I'd like a little bit of what they're smoking, because I don't see this as heading anywhere but the wrong direction at present. I'll just drill down for a moment now on the immediate politics of the shutdown. And please note, right, that today, nearly 50% blame the Republicans, only 30% blame the Democrats. So the disinformation, the spin that the Democrats are trying to give health care to illegal immigrants doesn't seem to be really shaping majority opinion yet. And please note that this is a recurring pattern, which is to say, with rare exception, the Republicans are blamed more for governmental shutdowns. We will have to see if this continues. But I want to put this in one final context for you before we wrap up, and to note two things, right? Donald Trump is at or near his lowest approval rating of his second term. And in particular, right, the idea that it's a 9.5% gap. 9.5% more people disapprove than approve of what he's doing. And it actually gets worse for Donald Trump if you look at the data by the strength of feelings. It is, right, 43% of the 53% who strongly disapprove of Donald Trump. Of the 43% who approve, only 27% strongly approve, right? So yes, we're polarized, but the support for Donald Trump is weaker than the condemnation of him. Final piece of the puzzle, I think, is just worth remembering, right? The jobs reports, the revisions that occurred in September show that we actually created nearly 1 million fewer jobs than we thought we created, right? And so that doesn't mean our economy hasn't created jobs, but it means our economy is a lot less healthy than we thought it was. This is not a good time to be furloughing maybe 1 million federal employees, to be closing down programs that people rely on for nutrition assistance and other forms of subsidies and aid. This will, if the economy is stalling, accelerate the tendency of the economy. I think it's not there yet, but the likelihood that it's going to enter a recession or a period of stagnation. And so the hope is that maybe some of these considerations actually lead Donald Trump and the Republican Party to do what the Democrats want them to do, to come to the table and to actually negotiate. I'm not predicting that. I'm not optimistic about that. If you ask me, I think this could go on for a long time, but that is where I see things standing right now. I will stop there. Obviously, shared a lot of information with you. I would love to hear your feedback. Who wants to start us out? Has California seen any major cuts in federal funding in the way that New York has? I don't know if you're following this, but New York lost $18 billion in federal funds for transportation projects, the Second Avenue subway line and a Hudson River tunnel, um, and purely punitive, right? Just because the government is shut down, we're going to take the money away. And this is occurring across the board. But I haven't followed the details with California. Anybody want to start us out? Silence? That's very uncharacteristic.
It's just too much to take in, David.
Okay, and
I
so
think
you
maybe
want some
David
time to
Pearson was
meditate on
trying
it?
to get off.
Somebody's got something.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think
go
David
ahead.
Pearson was trying. I was seeing his finger in his picture in a way that he might have been trying to uh, get
Yeah,
off. I don't know.
he's one of our reliable weekly contributors. David, can you hear me? Are you there? No. Okay, so um, I will do this. Let you guys meditate on this. This was a lot of information. And at the start of class next week, I'll give you 5 minutes if there's things that came over from this week or things that come over in the news, just to answer your questions, okay? All right, everybody.
That sounds fine. And say, looking at the agency websites and the propaganda that is at the head of them is an interesting exercise.
It's never been like this before, right? You know, we have government shutdowns, the parties play the blame game, but they don't use the government infrastructure to actually distribute propaganda, partisan BS, right? Yeah, it is different. And again, it speaks to, I think, the level of hyper partisanship in our politics right now and the way in which it's asymmetrically distributed. I don't think Joe Biden or Barack Obama or Kamala Harris would have been using the government websites to distribute their talking points.
It's
The use of AI is terrifying. The use of AI presentation,
Yeah.
putting words, false words in democratic mouths. It's
Yeah.
they the license they have to do feel that they can use any weapon.
And it's not just deep fakes, right? So it's efforts to make the Democrats appear to be saying something that they're not actually saying in order to make your lie more credible. It is also the use of racism, right? The use of racial stereotypes and the president, actually distributing this stuff, the vice president saying he just thinks it's funny. It's the most dignified, right, of the offices in our federal government, stooping to the lowest levels of partisan propaganda. It's not new, just to be as clear as possible, right? We've seen this before, but I do think the level of vitriol, the level of disingenuous, right, the level of lying is new, and is troubling. David, you're back. Were you trying to say something earlier? Somebody thought you were trying to.
No, I just went to the next room for a minute, but I did want to build on what was just said about the deep fakes and the like. I really thought that the cartoon-like caricatures that Trump posted last week for the Democratic leadership, I guess it was Schumer and Jeffries, was just unconscionable. I mean, just it goes so far beyond satire that I don't know how to respond to it. And I also felt that uh, the comments by Hegseth in particular last Monday were the low point in racist and sexist and misogynistic speech. I don't think I've ever heard a public official be that frank about what we suspect they think in their private thoughts, but are afraid to say publicly. I suppose in a perverse sort of way, we should be thankful that they say it out loud, because if they say it long enough and loud enough, even respectable conservatives will realize that it's a level of racism and misogyny that no society, and particularly our society, can't tolerate.
I hope you're right, David. I do hope you're right. I'll say this very quickly. I think Hegseth and Trump and Vance and really, many of the people who are public facing with this administration come out of the right-wing media ecosystem and get their news exclusively from the right-wing media ecosystem. I'm distressed and dismayed to say I think this is true of some of the Supreme Court justices as well, and that it's finding its way into their concurrences. But having said that, one of the things that I think we know when we study this, when we watch it, is that what is permitted, right? The quote permission structure of the right-wing media ecosystem is levels of hate and disinformation and racism, stereotyping. Hegseth also, in addition to his misogyny and sexism, engaged in a lot of, body discrimination, no more fat generals, right? The idea that this stuff is encouraged on social media, in part because of the anonymity. You're not directly in contact with the people you're communicating with, in part because of the peer-to-peer, almost schoolyard nature of the way in which social media operates, and the fact that the people who are in the upper echelons of the public-facing offices of the Trump administration come out of this world and remain in this world, right? They're not using the credible information gathering and analysis tools of the federal government. They're still getting their information from social media and from Fox. Does account for some of the vitriol, the anger, the stereotyping, the disinformation, the racism, the lying in their presentation of what they're doing to the American people. Now, here's the question. How many of us are repelled by that? And I do think that you're basically right, David, that a majority of us still are. But I do think, in a sense, it may be a shrinking portion as
Getting
well.
ignored.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I worry that this is a race to the bottom, and the Democrats I don't think can afford to not join the fight. But what that means is doing similarly problematic stuff, and that's going to further drive us apart in terms of polarization. All right, everybody. How's that for a note to end on? Let me do this instead. We started out talking about how are things there, right? And these little bubbles, these little communities that we belong to, where we show decency to each other, where we are concerned with each other, where we are civil with each other. And I hope that includes, right, some partisan, some ideological diversity. It does in my world. I'm fortunate in that way. But I at the same time that I think the news just gets worse with the week. And I'm sorry, my job with you is to convey it and to analyze it and to try to dig deep to explain it. I do value being with you and for the right opportunity to engage in these discussions and to feel a little source of comfort and support. So I hope you guys will be doing that with each other during the week. I look forward to being back with you next week to continue the conversation. Take care, everybody. Be
Absolutely.
well. Thank you. You too. And Shona Tova to those of you who celebrate. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, David.